come to the dissertation public presentation event today in this weather, our first flurry, and for the season anyway. So I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate three of our graduate students, Dr. Jihee Beak, Dr. Benoit, and Dr. Hoffman. So congratulations again. You have come a long way to today. Because I still remember three of you when you were in master program. Anna, you took my class with the older curriculum, the Introduction to Information Science. Do you remember, right? And Ed and Jihee were in the digital library class. And now you accomplished the mission to be a doctor, So that's a great opportunity, and I think that will also serve as a role model for the rest of our students as well, so you can see what's going to happen for you in a couple of years, right? It can be done. And I still remember one of my mentors who inspired me for my doctoral degree. He said, people can take everything from you, but there's one thing they cannot, your doctoral degree. So that's why I started to pursue my degree long time ago. I don't want to tell you how long, but it was quite long. So I hope everyone will here in this room will have the opportunity to accomplish what you want to accomplish too. So I just want to move things forward. Today we have three presenters, and we have about 2 hours. So what I advise the three of them is to prepare a 25 to 30 minutes presentation. Then we have a couple minutes for question and answer. As I said before, the food is coming late, so we'll have Jihee. Jihee is very nervous right now to present first, so she can have some lunch later, right? And then we'll have a break, and then Ed and Anna will present. Okay, and let me briefly introduce Jihee. Of course, as you know, Jihee had a master's degree and a PhD degree at the School of Information Study, University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee here. And her dissertation is mostly about developing a child-driven metadata scheme based on children's cognitive behavior during book selection. And she actually was the award winner for the Doctoral Student Research Poster competition at the ALICE conference. We sent a email before, right? So congratulations on that. And her research mostly focused on knowledge organization system, particular metadata scheme for children's resource, domain analysis, social tagging. She also teaches information organization and metadata courses in different school and university, right? That's one thing probably shouldn't be recorded. She also rejected the offer as an assistant professor, but for the time being, she's still working on something new. So without further delay.
Okay. I thought that was off the record, but
nothing is off the record now.
I'm really glad to introduce my dissertation today. My dissertation is about a child-driven metadata schema, and I want to show how I developed. So first, I want to share my personal stories. I'm from South Korea, right? And I got my undergraduate degree from South Korea in library and information science. So since I studied library and information science, I used to go to public libraries, and I don't know why, but I love children, so I used to go to children's library a lot. And whenever I go to children's library, I found mess. Like books are all over, and children just pull the books and they just throw the books, or I don't know whether even they read books. And then I came to America, and of course I visit some local public libraries and children's section. Same situation. Disaster. The American kids also pull the books and they just, plug it, and they put the books in a wrong spot and make, librarians miserable. So I was thinking, library cataloging system or classification system don't work for children. So I think, okay, what is the problem, and I want to solve this situation. So I was looking at the current situation with the metadata schema for children. Many school libraries and public libraries in the United States use the library cataloging standard like AACR 2 Mark 21, Dewey Decimal Classification, FC Subject Heading, etc. They're not originally developed to describe children's research. It was only for books, and it was designed by adults. But that's why maybe it doesn't work for children. I'm shaking still. Okay. So there is no specialized knowledge organization system for children. Here is a research problem. So there is a definitely need for a new or alternative metadata schema for children, and it should be developed by children. So this is why I'm doing. So my theoretical framework of this research is the relationship between information retrieval and information organizations. Within information organization, there are two aspects: users' expression or users' information needs, and representation of information. Without well-organized, well-structured information organization system, we cannot support information retrieval. So that's why we often call information organization and information retrievals are two sides of a coin, right? So, so lots of times, we studied users' information seeking behaviors to develop the information retrieval, or we studied natural language process or indexing, something like that, more system-centered approach to improve the information retrieval system. But since I focus on information organization, I was looking at this level. So users' information needs and seeking behavior should be reflected in representation of information. That's the main theory. But when I look at the relationship between expression of users and representation of information, I found some interesting relationship, because I studied the cognitive science from education psychology department. And when users start to seek for information, cognitive process occurred. And cognitive process consists of three steps in general. First is the perception. People perceive the conceptual aspect first, which is corresponding to metadata elements. And the second step is categorization and naming. Maybe I should give you example. Okay, let me drink water. I am holding this water. When we perceive this information here, I'm thirsty, so to me this is just water as a liquid. But if you are a designer of bottle or something like that, maybe you perceive the appearance of this bottle, or maybe you are more interested in the material of this bottle. This is about conceptual aspect. What kind of aspect of information you want to perceive, which is corresponding to the metadata elements. And then you perceive those certain aspect of the information, and you put those information in your memory scheme. So you kind of categorize those concepts in the structure of your memory. In knowledge organization system, those categorizations represented in classification or thesaurus format. And then last thing is, now you have some structure concept, you want to start to use it. To do so, you have to label those concepts. That is a linguistic expression, which is represented by contour vocabularies or subject headings, etc. So this is my really general theoretical framework, and what I focus is the first step, perception, and how perception can be represented in metadata schema. To do so, my purpose of my dissertation is to understand children's perceptual cognitive factors related to book selection in multiple dimensions in order to develop a child-driven, child-appropriate metadata schema for children's research. So I have a broad research questions. The first is, what metadata elements do children like to use? What elements should child-driven metadata scheme include? To answer for this broad research question, I had more operational research questions. The first one is, what perceptual cognitive factors and facets do children use to select books? And once I identify these factors and facets, I ask, what roles do cognitive factors and facets play in context of developing metadata schema? And last is, how can child-driven metadata elements be defined. Now I'm talking about research design. So first, recruitment. I have a really long story. I can cry. It was really challenging to recruit children. Of course, IRB was tough too. I used a snowball sampling strategy, and I recruit children on site through Milwaukee Public Library and other city library systems in Milwaukee County. And also I used the social network site, Facebook, to recruit children. So I appreciate all my colleagues, all my friends to help me to find the subject. But unique differences in my research design was influenced by Rita's dissertation and her works. But the differences from her work and mine is I use a pair recruitment. Pair recruitment is whenever I recruited a child, I ask her or him to bring their friends. So because I had a pilot study for this dissertation, right? And at that time I interacted with I interacted with a kid, just me and kid. I love kids, and they love me because how can't I, right? So it was great, but still there is some barriers. Not only I'm a Korean, because there is some language barriers and cultural barriers as well. Because I didn't grow up in this country, I don't know what Scooby-Doo is, So there is some lack of communication, and also even though we like each other, but still they consider me as an adult and researcher. So to reduce those kind of challenges, I think it's better to let them talk to each other with their friends. So if that it is more intuitive and natural data. So my participants, I recruited 11 pairs, 22 children in Milwaukee area, and the data collection happened from August to September 2013. And they're 6 to 8 years old. The reason why I focus on the little early elementary school students are because their cognitive developments, the abilities are different from the older kids. And I use the BSS cognitive development stage theory to define those age. And grade is first to third grade, and females are a little bit, more than males. Okay, and data collection. I used triangulated qualitative research method consisting of questionnaire, observation, interview, and diary. So there are 2 steps. First is initial meeting. So I have to meet them first and introduce myself, and I want to know their background information, demographic information, or something like that. So I, obtain some information about what is their favorite characters, or how, what is their favorite books, or something like that. So I gain some kind of background information first. And then they are required to visit local libraries 3 times, and each library took about an hour. During the library visit, I video record their interactions with their friends and books, or someone else. Maybe it can be librarian, or maybe their mom, or something like that. But within library visit, I start with diary review to warm up. Because when children came, I cannot just let's select book. It's kind of awkward, So I asked them to keep the diary, which is the supplementary data outside of the library setting. And diary had some semi-structured questions. For example, I asked, "What did you read?" Instead of I ask them, "What is the book title that you read?" I ask them, "What did you read?" I want to know how they explain their reading, Maybe instead of telling the title, they might describe the book they read is like, I read a funny book. I want to know those kind of different data. So that is how I create the diary questions. And then we overview these diaries, and then I let them find the books. During those time, I use a pair think aloud. So two kids think aloud together. So this method worked really, really well because it generated more intuitive and richer data. So if I interact with it, I probably couldn't get what they did on Saturday, which is related to their book selection behavior. So that worked really well, and I think this makes my dissertation kind of unique. And then I did the interview, which is think after. So to obtain better understanding of the children's behavior, sometimes there might be some misunderstanding between me as a researcher and children. So to confirm my observation, I had one more step by having the interview. So I had 34 video files. It's huge, and I had to transcribe. And luckily, Sois supports the PhD student very well. So I was able to hire the undergrad student and master student to transcribe my data, and it was more than 400 pages with font, 10-size font, single, just huge. But anyway, I did it. So to analyze my data, I used the grounded theory approach. One benefit of grounded theory approach is it can highlight when a phenomena has not been explored. So when researchers aim to discover new concepts or core concept or theory out of the empirical data, grounded theory works better. So to me, grounded theory approach enables me to not only explore and understand children's cognitive process and information-seeking behaviors, and also it generates the children's-driven metadata schema through the interpretation of emergent and new concepts and their interrelationships. So this is my findings. I don't know whether you can see very well. Those are the emergent cognitive factors and facets. And factors are more likely like concrete and perceived through the sensory by looking and touching and listening, something like that. And facets are based through these factors. I define what kind of aspect of books they want to perceive. For example, like character's name has been used to perceive the character information and familiarity and series. So even though they're read the name of character's name, or they recognize the characters and they say the character's name, but what they really want to know is character, and characters are usually in series. They want to perceive series information and the familiarity. So these are all my factors and facets, and I explain each individual, each factors and facets. And the other findings is, interestingly, I found lots of emergent vocabularies of emotion. So they say, wow, this is awesome, or this is scary, I don't like it, or those kind of all emotional vocabularies. So I decide to identify these emergent vocabularies, and I analyze how these emergent emotional vocabularies co-occur with other cognitive factors. And these are top 30 cognitive factors and facets occurring with the emotional vocabularies. So whenever they see pictures, they oftentimes say, awesome, pretty, or I like it, or I don't like it, or something like that. So because I use the Envivo software to to analyze my data, I was able to generate this multidimensional scaling plot. And as it's kind of small, right? So emotion is in the center. So okay, let's zoom in. So as you can see, emotion plays a central role to perceive the book information while they selecting books. So that was interesting findings, and these emotional vocabularies helped me to create the metadata elements. The more they like the more a factor is strongly associated with emotional vocabularies, means children want to find books with that, cognitive factors. So based on that, I developed a child-driven metadata schema. This is just structure of my child-driven metadata schema. These structures are influenced by doubling core metadata schema, and it includes metadata elements, definition, comments, refinements, and value type. So I have a lot, but this is only one example of character elements. So I define the character, what character means, and I provide some comments about characters. So any descriptive information such as appearance of characters can be provided. So for character genders, name, see, characters, gender, and characters name elements. So I define character-related elements here. So it was pretty hard because defining something was very challenging. And I also provide the value type, whether it's a free text or if it is a male and female can be provided as a constraint format. So to help the audience understand, this metadata schema, how it's going to be, implemented, I provide the value type example as well. So I identified and named 5 classes and 33 metadata elements. So these are the 5 classes, and these are the elements, and I have one more slide for elements. These highlighted parts are different from the existing cataloging system standard. They don't really describe a story of setting. Children love to read. They say, I want to read a jungle book. They don't mean they want to read about jungle. They want to read a story occurring in jungle setting. So the setting does matter. And the characters, name, gender, they say, I don't want to read this book. And the other kids say, why? It has a boy. They're a girl. So they care about gender. And sometimes they look at this image, they say, he's fat, I don't like it, or something, those kind of information. Character does matter. Color, they say, I want to read a red book. What is red, right? The dominant color in the book cover. So they remember those color information when they seek for books. And, I want to read the lions or something that is an object or something like that. Okay, and engagement element is when book has some kind of engaging element. For example, the A to Z mystery series hide the little letter in the illustrations, and children love to find those hidden letters while reading. So those engagement elements are important to be provided when we describe the children's books. And tone, I want to read a happy book, scary book, something like that. So, okay, so I have enough time. This is metadata record example. My child-driven metadata schema has not been implemented in any practice yet. It's more theoretical so far. But that is my research agenda, right, for my tenure track. But I create imaginary child-driven metadata record, and if you compare with the OCLC WorldPad record, children driven metadata schema provide different access point or descriptive metadata element. Book shape. This book has a really funny story. This book shapes like a dog house, like this, and it has a fur, like doggy fur. These two kids found this book, and one of kids checked out the book. And next time when they visit library, they don't remember author's name, even they don't remember book titles, but they want to find this book again. So they say, I want to read a doggy book. What is doggy book? Like, well, it looks like there is something that I can touch, I can feel. Like, it was red. It doesn't look like just book. It looks like pointy. That is how they remember and how they describe this book. So they're really struggling for like 15 minutes. I say, why don't you go to the library and ask? They say, okay. Then they describe exactly what I just described. Librarian say, what is the author name? Okay, do you remember title? No. But it's a Mr. Augie book. Even they don't say doggy, they say Mr. Augie book, right? Librarian gave up. So eventually, somehow, they found this book, but what they remember is those characteristics of book. I think my child-driven metadata schema can support to describe this kind of children's information expression. And another example is more focused on the character. Sometimes they remember a character's name, or sometimes they say there's a yellow, red, or something like that. If then they can find the books through the character information. So after I identify cognitive factors and facets, and based on that, I developed my child-driven metadata schema. So, and then I read going back to previous literature to understand the holistic understanding of children's cognitive process during the book selection. So I create this. This is my whole understanding. That first, children's cognitive processes consist of three levels. The first level is associated with psychological states of emotion or affection. So psychological experience include attention, emotion, or purpose or intention that is consciously or unconsciously perceived at the psychological level. This psychological experience of feeling influence children's perception during the book selection. In particular, children's previous experience and emotional interest, they say, I want to read a storybook or something like that, creates a boundary of a perception, like a lens, like a lens to see those phenomena. So there are so many books in the library, right? So many information in the library. However, somehow previous experience allow children to look at only certain information. And then the second level is the perceptual level. This perceptual level is a little bit different from psychological. Perceptual level, they are more focusing on physical interaction or reaction to books. So again, when they look at books, they are looking or feeling certain aspect of books. So like color or something like that. And cognitive is something that I observe. So through those psychological and perceptual, they want to perceive certain cognitive aspects like difficulties or characters or subject or something like that. They're not really linear, but they occur more dynamically. And to explain this understanding, I visit the information processing theory and attention. When we perceive lots of information, what does matter is what we pay attention to. So to explain that, attention and emotion plays a very important role. And information processing theory said there are some factors influencing attention, and these factors are really corresponding to what I found in cognitive factors and facets. The other one is emotion, right? How emotion plays a role in knowledge organization system. For example, the Knowledge database provides those appeal appealing factors to describe the fictions, although it's not for children, but these factors are kind of similar to what I found too. And finally, the children, as I said, when they look at books, they look at only certain aspect. It is because of their personal experience. So this idea is also can be reinterpreted by Husserl's Louis's ego and applicant. Their personal experience really bracket their perception to select the books. Okay, conclusion. My dissertation displays an early stage of ontological contour for children's knowledge organization systems. And again, the child-driven metadata schema suggests the different metadata elements from what the existing metadata elements describe. And it is because I use the user-driven approach. So my empirical data, these cognitive factors and subsets are evidence why this metadata element should work better, or why we should create the metadata elements for children. So I kind of lose. So this is the whole conclusion, and I think my dissertation can contribute to improving knowledge organization system to better represent children's perception. And also, again, the theoretical work and framework says the relationship between IR and IO, right? Because now we are well-organized information organization systems, so now we can provide better browsing, searching interface, or access point for information retrieval purpose as well. And once children find the book by themselves, they have a positive experience of reading and finding books, which influence their information, literacy skill and reading skill as well. So I think this is all my dissertation, and my advisors are not here, my co-chairs, but I really appreciate my two co-chairs, my mentor and professor, Dr. Hope Olson, and my advisor, Richard Smaglia, and other, Margaret Kipp, Terence Newell, and Dr. Kyung-Boon Kwon from Education Psychology. I really appreciate all your feedbacks and all your support. Thank you. Can I take a question now?
Yeah, sure. Although you already smell the food, but anyway.
That's good.
Any questions?
Will you make your slides available?
Sure, why not?
Yeah, why don't you send to me? I can send
Okay.
to the whole PhD.
Okay.
Yeah.
Given you've discovered that young children have a unique way of looking at how to find information, what sort of implications, or can you speculate as to how you might want to change an interface or the retrieval features of the retrieval system to accommodate the interest in the way children search?
So the previous literature said children prefer browsing searching than keyword search. So I think we can provide different access points, like we can let them browse books by book covers color, or we can, provide the famous characters' names, or if there is an engagement element, do you want to play with this book or something like that? We can, accommodate those kind of different access points in browsing search interface. And of course, again, it's not implemented. I don't know how it's going to look like in the future, but I'm thinking to work with the school library management vendors. So I want to test this one with the children. So which elements they prefer more, in the future. So maybe browsing search interface can, change those access points.
How do you see a schema like this and implementation into a vendor system influencing education of children's librarians? What do you think will happen with that?
Children's librarian?
Yeah, for the librarian specifically, like the librarian who couldn't help
Yeah.
find the book.
I I'm working on another project right now, how the school librarian librarianship program take, how can I say, how school librarian information organization course is like a mandatory, like for many high schools or library schools. But I want to know how, whether the school librarians program requires students to take the cataloging class or not, So I think there is a really lack of education in school librarianship in terms of knowledge organization or information organization education. So that is something that I'm working on right now, but I want to create a different course for cataloging or information organization course for school librarians or children's librarians, so that they can focus on learning unique characteristics of children's information seeking behavior and how they can organize those children's resources.
You mentioned some important element that the metadata schema has not touched, which is important to identify. Example, when you look at different schemas, they have not really considered children's. So now, it's like you use some of the doubling core elements, right? Okay, now, how your research really makes sense to some of the schema in trying to adopt the adaptability of the, to address some of the key points like a shelf, object size, whatever. Most of the schemas has not touched about it, even with added value. How your research work? Because like now, if I get you right, you use some of the element of doubling core to try to find, and you also identify some of elements that are missing in most of the schema, like all the schemas. So now, how can you integrate your research to make sure that those who develop the schema address the issue?
I don't know whether I understand your question correctly. If you're talking about the interoperability in metadata,
Yeah.
So I consider that interoperability issues when I create the metadata schema. That's why I use the doubling core, the format. So some metadata elements like the title, series, authors I didn't create. I refer to those existing, well-structured elements. But so far, the unique metadata elements might not be really interoperable with other metadata schemas existing out there. But maybe when I start to implement, I have more issues about interoperability in the future. So far I don't have that, I don't have answer for how to solve that, interoperability issues at this point.
Then you mentioned in one of your discussions that the children regard you as a researcher, as an adult. How does, like their own perception, they just regard you as how they are thinking quickly know that you are a researcher?
Oh, well, sometimes, they're not only because I'm an adult and researcher, I'm new to them, I'm a stranger to them. So they are reluctant to, talk with me, or they're, and also children have tendency to answer what a researcher wants to hear. That is the, big research, there is a big literature about how to, some issues in children as a subject. So through my pilot research, I kind of feel children do not share more story with me. They just, sometimes they look at me and they just keep checking whether they answer correctly or not, which is, there is no correct answer, but they keep checking me. So it's kind of like, whenever I see those kind of signs, I try to like, no, it's okay, just say something, whatever you want. There is no right answer, but still there is a little bit of barrier between me and so kids. More questions? Okay, let's have lunch.
Thank you. I also want to thank our doctor. Today will be a little bit over time, so fine. And Dr. Benoit actually has his BA and MA degree in history from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee.
It's all from here.
All from here. Maybe you think about another one here. And Dr. Benoit is currently assistant professor in the School for Library Information Science at Louisiana State University, LSU. He is coordinating the archive specialization at LSU now. And his research explores methods for increasing access to archival collection through community and participatory archive. He has published in Journal of Documentation and Information Research and has presented numerous national and international conferences. He is currently developing 2 new research projects. Maybe you can talk about the project yourself. So,
Actually, those I won't be.
Oh, okay. But anyway, I just want to mention Dr. Benoit actually was our first student president, right, for the school. And he also was the first chief editor for the newsletter. So, for all the service he has done for the school. So without further delay, go ahead.
Let's get this started. You can think of this as your lunchtime entertainment, the entertainment portion of today. Thanks for inviting me and having me this afternoon. Before we get started, I just want to make sure to acknowledge and thank my committee members, Iris, Wusab Jones, Donald Force, Margaret Kipp, and Paul Conway, who is from the University of Michigan, as well as thanking SOAS for generously supporting the PhD program, in this case, specifically with the Drago funding, which helped me entice my participants with a little bit of money to help them to participate. So my study, it's in case you have no idea, it's hashtag MPLP, a comparison of domain novice and expert user-generated tags in a minimally processed digital archive. So it does meet the dissertation requirement of having at least a 2-line title. But we'll get into what MPLP is for the majority of you here who do not have an archives background. For this presentation, I'll start out by talking a little bit about a background into archives and where this research comes from. I'll highlight the research questions, discuss the methodology, and then get to the results, implications, the dreaded limitations, and the future directions of my research. So a little bit of background on where this study comes from. Howard Zinn in the 1970s, infamously in the archival world, called on archives to, quote, take the trouble to compile a whole new world of documentary material about the lives, desires, and needs of ordinary people, and to begin to play some small part in the creation of a real democracy. Zinn's comments, along with others, really initiated the postmodern movement in archival studies and within archives. And we started to see this massive rise of the breadth of the types of material collected and also who the material was created by entering into the archive. Unfortunately, while we saw a lot more material coming into the archive, we didn't see more staff to process the material coming into the archive. And in fact, it wasn't just a stagnation of staff. Over the past 30 years, archival staff numbers have significantly dwindled and dropped, as we've seen with funding in libraries and archives in general. So this leads to a rising backlog problem in the 1980s, 90s, through the aughts, and including today. And the backlog problem, these are collections in the archive where they've already been processed into the archive, but they are not accessible at all. There's no catalog description, there is no finding aid description, and for the most part, researchers, unless you are intimately familiar with that particular repository, have no idea they exist. The backlog problem got so bad that several archives housed more unprocessed collections than processed ones, meaning a majority of the collections that they took care of were not accessible to the general public. As a direct response to this, in 2005, Green and Meisner proposed what then was a drastic shift in archival practice towards the concept that they called more product, less process. In the archival world, we now refer to this as MPLP, and it really stems out of several prior studies focused on minimal processing. Now, these earlier studies never really took hold, and it wasn't until Green and Meisner in 2006 kind of threw down the gauntlet that the archives world really took up this call. So what exactly is MPLP? It aims for something that they call the golden minimum. It strives to identify and implement minimum standard levels of processing across collections. What is the bare minimum that we have to do for all these collections to make things accessible quickly? It does not preclude processing at a much more detailed level on occasion, but it does set the bar that every collection needs to be described and arranged at a minimal level. So what does this really have to do with digital archives? Well, MPLP was not just limited to the physical arranging and describing of archives. In fact, it spread through all of the archival endeavor, from arrangement description to preservation to outreach and reference, and ultimately to digital archives. Now, those of you who have used digital collections in the past, you will note that most digital collections and digital libraries have metadata at the item level, and they describe things at the item level. This is very counterintuitive for archivists, and those collections that adhere to minimal processing prefer to prioritize the collection as a whole, to look at things in the aggregate rather than at the individual level. So in this case, for digital collections, they provide metadata at the folder or series level. Let me give you an example of how this would work. If you had, let's say, a folder filled with correspondence, with letters, the traditional approach has individual metadata for each letter. Who the letter was written by, what are the contents, what's the date, subject terms, and all of that. In a minimally processed, or MPLP digital archive, the entire folder shares the same metadata. It's just at the folder level, and then you let the users flip through and figure out what's actually in that folder. So there's clearly a problem here. Minimal processing, it's great at getting more things online, making more collections accessible online quickly. However, you're now trading that off for less access points. And studies have shown, and I'm sure this is not a surprise to anybody, that users demand increased access points. They want more description, they want more access in order to use the collections. So this kind of sets the stage for the general dissertation. And if we look at what I was trying to accomplish, I was suggesting that we take social tagging and cues from social tagging to really supplement the access points within the digital collection. Unfortunately, studies in archives and with archivists have demonstrated a reluctance to use social tagging. There are fears over quality control. Who are the taggers? What types of tags will they create? There are fears about spam and inconsistent tagging. And there's a call from both users and archivists that we need some sort of quality assurance. So I propose using users' prior domain knowledge somewhat as a quality control. Essentially, users who are experts who have an expert domain knowledge about the collection that they're tagging, then we should be able to rely on those tags automatically. And that this would be useful as a quality control mechanism. And this avoids other ideas that have come up about, well, the archivist can just approve and disapprove each tag. In my small study, I had over 10,000 tags. I don't think we're paying an archivist to sit there and click yes or no for 10,000 tags. So, the dissertation as a whole focused on many research questions, as I'm sure those of you who have written a dissertation are well aware of. Research question 1, what are the similarities and differences between tags generated by expert and novice users in a minimally processed digital archive? 1B, are there differences between expert and novices' opinions in the tagging experience and tag creation considerations? 2A, in what ways do tags generated by experts or novice users in a minimally processed collection correspond with the metadata in a traditionally processed collection? This question is actually looking at, okay, so we're not doing item level description. Can the tags just fill in what normally would be there? That's really what question 2 is looking at. 2B, does user knowledge affect the proportion of tags matching unselected metadata in a minimally processed digital archive? And there's a third with 2 more. In what ways do tags generated compare with existing users' search terms? And then finally, does user knowledge affect the proportion of tags matching query terms? If anybody's interested, I can also send you a link with like the 30 hypotheses involved in all of this too. But this is enough to really get going on. Now, unfortunately, we have a half an hour. I can talk for 4 or 5 hours about this. So I'll really only focus on 3 sub-questions. 1A, looking at what types of tags are created. 2B and 3B, then looking at how they compare with the metadata and user query terms today. One of the other issues in archival science and archival studies right now is a significant lack of empirical research. And I wanted to address that with the study's design, as well as my dissertation research questions. So the methodology I decided to rely on was a mixed methods quasi-experimental design. The participants, there were 60 participants, 30 novices, and 30 experts, who each generated a minimum of 1 tag for 15 photographs and 15 documents that were made up the sample collection, and I'll talk about the sample collection momentarily. This study was conducted completely online. I never had to speak to any of my participants. If anybody is interested in doing something like that, talk to me. I'm happy to show you how to navigate through Qualtrics and set up quotas and all the fun, fancy things you can do with it. Originally, I intended to use self-identification as a way of determining prior knowledge. So if a person says they're an expert in a field, we can trust them that they're an expert in their field. I then looked at that research. That was a bad idea. The research is very mixed, and it actually comes out of education, really. So I did create, during the pre-questionnaire process, some sort of mechanism for determining prior knowledge. In this case, their prior knowledge was assessed through a 10-question multiple choice quiz about the sample collection's topic. Interested users who scored 7 to 10 inclusively were deemed experts. Those who scored 0 to 4 were novices. And those who scored 5 to 6 were deemed intermediaries. For this study, the intermediaries were thanked for their interest and politely dismissed, so that I could really focus on the disparity between experts and novices. In retrospect, I should have kept the intermediaries for future research, so I would have had that data. Now I have to go back and replicate that data for the future. So keep that in mind, PhD students. You might just want to collect data for the future. And like I said, the participants were compensated for their effort. There was also a post-questionnaire, which we won't be getting into some of those details today. As far as the analysis, it's mixed methods, so there's some qualitative and some quantitative. Open coding of the tags themselves, and content analysis of some of the post-questionnaire statements. There was descriptive statistics, t-test, chi-square, and the Fun-Man-Whitney U tests for this study. So the sample collection I used was derived out of an existing collection here at UWM, the March on Milwaukee Civil Rights History Project. This collection was actually chosen for multiple reasons, and I will admit convenience was one of them. Convenience of this collection being here at UWM provided me access to the real server logs, the metadata of the collection, and the structure, which made it a lot easier for me. I didn't take the entire collection. I took 15 documents and 15 photographs from a sub-collection, the James Groppe papers held within this. I also selected this collection because I know a little bit about Milwaukee history. I know a little bit more than a little bit. And because I know Milwaukee history and I know researchers in Milwaukee history, it was easier to tap into potential participants for the study. The sample collection was presented to the participants as if it was minimally processed. So all of the letters shared one set of metadata, all the photographs shared one set of metadata at the aggregate level, and then I created and I aggregated the unselected metadata, the metadata that was not provided to them, that exists in the real collection for analysis later. I am very pleased with what turned out with my participants. For the most part, it was a very heterogeneous group. If we look at scoring, experts averaged 7.6, novices about 2.8. Age range from 18 to 63, with an average age of 32. Experts tended to be slightly older than the novices, with an average of 35 compared to 28 for the novices. And the gender breakdown was 23, 75, and 2, if you are interested in that. As far as location of my participants, not surprisingly, the majority of them came from Wisconsin, and Illinois, actually. But I did have participants from all of the highlighted states here. Washington, for some odd reason, was very interested in participating. They were the third most popular with 5 participants. But I was very pleased to see a nice geographical swath, except for the plains, represented in my study. As far as the racial composite, participants were able to indicate more than one race, which provided a much richer designation. And I compared what I had with the Census Bureau's estimates from 2012 for the Midwest region, and it actually replicates it fairly well. The census, it was 69% compared to 31% white, non-white, and my study had 67% and 33% white, non-white. So I was very pleased with that as well. Okay, let's actually get to the tags, the whole point of this. Through the open coding of all the tags for both documents and photographs, I was able to develop 7 major categories of tags, one of which had 2 categories. And I'll walk through these different categories and provide specific examples that relate to this image. For those of you in the back, this will come into play. It says Wagon 722 on that sign. The first category in the coding scheme was replication of metadata. These were tags that simply identified metadata that was already provided. This was actually something that disappointed me a lot, the higher percentage of this, which replicates prior studies by Musa Jung on YouTube. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But in some examples relating to this picture, Groppe, Father Groppe, and photograph. There were tags that were format focused. They identified, described, or otherwise focused on the format of the material, the item. So black and white photography in this case. The category with two subcategories is subject. There was subject general and subject specific. Subject general were tags that identified objects, places, or people in the photograph or letter with just common nouns, such as big man, police, riot gear, wagon. The specific version identified the objects, the places, the people, or even dates within the photograph or letter with proper nouns, and provided much more specific, detailed information, such as Wagon 722, which is what that sign said, Milwaukee Police, or 1967. There were content summary tags that summarized the scene or the letter contents, such as arrested, detained priest, or inside police vehicle. The context tags placed the photograph or letter within a much more broader historical context, such as Catholic social action, civil rights movement, and race. There were emotional tags that reflected some sort of emotional response by the participant, such as unjust and acceptance. And then there was the incorrect category. The incorrect tags, there were several tags where I looked at them and said, I really don't agree with this interpretation, but it was a valid interpretation, and so they were placed in a different category. The incorrect tags provided incorrect information that was completely wrong, such as courtroom. When I looked into the incorrect tags more carefully, they came from only a handful, 2 or 3 participants who seemed to just keep putting in a large number of tags and reusing many tags over time. So it was at such a minuscule percentage, it didn't really bother me that much. Oh dear Lord. Intercoder reliability, Tolstoy and Kolinske demonstrated and confirmed that the coding scheme worked out well. And now I'm going to fast forward a little bit here. If you look at the results, the number of tags, like I said, it was close to 10,000 total. And it ranged from a minimum of the 30 all the way to one person generated over 1,000 tags. I would like to meet that person in the future. But there were actually a handful of taggers who really skewed the data, and I had to remove them and recalculate the mean. And when I did that, the novices created more tags on average, but they created less unique tags. So they were duplicating each other more often. I did conduct an analysis to see if there was a relationship between the number of tags generated and the prior domain knowledge, and that t-test demonstrated that there was not a statistically significant difference. I actually conducted it both with the outliers and without, and came up with the same result. Looking specifically at the types of tags, if we look at photographs, you see some general trends develop. Novices focus more on general subject terms, whereas experts were more content, summary, and context tags driven. And this really comes out of how experts and novices look at images. The novice, not knowing much about the image, will start picking out little details, and that's what they put in as tags, whereas the experts are thinking more broadly. What is the big picture going on here? A chi-squared test for association between the domain group and the types of tags was conducted, and it was found to be statistically significant. However, the Kramer's V was so low that the association is weak at best. Compared to documents, documents, and pardon the pun here, provide a different picture than photographs. In general, novices found documents easier than the photographs. because now they have text. And so they can really see what's going on to create this. Again, statistics tests were done to see if there was a relationship. And again, there was a statistically significant chi-square here. And again, the Kramer's V is so low that it's weak at best. Like I said earlier, I want to make sure that, or check to see if the tags that are being created would replicate the metadata not presented to the users, the so-called unselected metadata. Because this could indicate that we can easily just put them in instead of the item level description. And for both photographs and documents, the expert tags replicated that unselected metadata more often than the novices. But not surprisingly, if you combined both, you get a higher result again. Individual chi-square tests were run for the photographs and the document data. The photographs found a statistically significant but a weak association, and the documents found no statistical association between the two. Moving on to the query terms, I then wanted to look at, well, how do the tags compare to what users are actually searching for? So I parsed out query logs from January 2014 and found 59,000 unique query terms to search across all digital collections and 1,600 that were specific just for March on Milwaukee. And I then used these to compare to the tags that were generated. Expert users tags again match the query term lists more often than novices, but again, wow, that's black on blue, that's not good. That was white at one point. But again, the combination does even better still. Individual chi-squares were run on all of these different associations, and they all found a very mild, statistically significant result. This is becoming a theme in this study. Statistical significance at a very low association. So in the end, what does this all mean? What are some of the theoretical implications? It means I was wrong with my initial thoughts. That just relying on the tags from experts does not actually provide you a good quality control mechanism because it doesn't provide you the full picture. You really need both sides. And I'll get back to that with the practical implications. From a theoretical perspective, it's really, the study really emphasizes the role of postmodernism and how tagging can play a part. Because of the study's heterogeneous population, you also saw a very wide variety of descriptions being put into play. Additionally, when analyzing this data and looking at it in the bigger picture, including both expert and novice users' tags within a digital collection further advances us towards the democratization of the archive. How can we include more outside voices and limit the official or the standard archival voice in the archive? From a theoretical perspective, it generated the empirical evidence that is so often called for in archival studies, but never actually conducted. And it also answered the call from many previous studies that dealt with looking at the influence of peer collaboration, as well as fears about what kind of tags were being created and what that could mean for archives. From a practical implication sense, there's a lot of practical implications. I'm clearly not going through all of these today. So what I'm going to highlight is that first and foremost, social tags are value additive. That's to say that the inclusion of social tags increases the amount of access points, and we really need to include both expert novice tags. Let's get to that one. Sorry. that we need to include both the expert and the novice tags, as well as those intermediaries that I didn't include in my study, to really get a well-rounded view. Secondly, archivists need to provide instructions on how to tag. This is from one of the other sub-questions, but it came out that people would love to create tags, they would love to help out, but they have no idea how or what the archives is looking for. And this can just be an email, it can be a short video, it's just something to help the archives out. And then finally, while tags may never entirely replace item-level metadata, they do provide enough coverage that questions the need for labor-intensive practices of item-level description. Of course, there are limitations, lack of the immediate group, the controls put onto the quasi-experimental. 60 participants is a small number of participants, and I only use documents and photographs. I'd be interested to see moving images and audio, how that would change things. As far as future research, I would like to look into additional or alternative factors, additional formats. A nice longitudinal study of real tag development is always ideal, as well as the effectiveness within an information retrieval system. How well tags help real users find items? And also, how can we motivate taggers? Tagging, unfortunately, is not an if you build it, they will come system. You need to get them to the trough and actually start entering in tags. This real collection, I looked at it recently, has been available to tag for over a year, and I believe there's 2 tags. So we need to motivate taggers. So as a conclusion, the dissertation's findings really support the postmodernist approach. It's very ironic that Green and Meisner created this wonderful condition with minimal processing for a postmodern system to limit the archival voice, increase outside voices, and inclusion through social tagging, even though both Green and Meisner really don't like postmodernism. MPLP and access. MPLP, minimal processing, it increases access through increasing the number of collections available. Including social tagging, we can now bring the access points back up to the level they were before. And finally, social tagging is wonderful for user engagement. Social tagging provides an avenue that participants and users can find ownership and agency within the collection. They recognize the power of the archive and its existence, which makes them more likely to reconnect with the archive in the future, particularly in a harsh funding environment. And in archives, user participation, engagement, community driven. These are all things that we need to be looking for. Ooh, sorry, ran a little over. But thank you, and I will take questions. Now that's hard to do in a half an hour. Sure.
Okay, I just was curious, you said there were some incorrects, and,
Yes. And I'd skip over that later.
and were they from novices or experts, or did you not even know?
They were from both. They were actually, all of them were from what I called the super taggers. Taggers that tag more than 500. But it was less, I believe it was, off the top of my head, 0.5% of all the tags. So it was only, I think, 10 in total.
Okay, so there's no guarantee though that it was.
I can't do that math real quick. 0.5 times 10,000. Somebody should.
Is there any, how would you deal with that then, like if you are in a, I mean, that is so little, maybe you would have just ignored it, but if you're in this kind of situation where you're implementing this kind of a, interactive system, how do you deal with those incorrect? You're gonna go through 10,000 and throw those out, or is you just gonna?
This is where the system design, a lot of the tagging systems now will include a report feature where if a user comes across a tag that's incorrect, they can flag it for review.
Okay.
And until you get somebody who just starts flagging everything, I think that's a reasonable way of doing it, because you're right, you can't keep looking for these things. Michael?
No, that was generally where I was going.
Okay. Yes.
have a question, and this might have been in the practical implications you weren't able to get to, but talking about democratizing access points or the archives, and I'm just wondering though, it almost seems like it might be an incursion on the professional turf of the archivists. So I'm wondering, from a practical perspective, do you anticipate there might be pushback from archivists?
Well, this is actually a very active area where you see pushback saying, well, we can't allow tagging, but we can't do it ourselves, so what do we do? But the community archives and participatory archives model has now gained enough of a foothold that it really is becoming more, I wouldn't say it's commonplace yet, but more and more people are interested. I conducted a study about 5 years ago that looked at the perceptions of social tagging by digital archivists and digital librarians, and I didn't get a chance to publish it, so I was able to now go back 5 years later and reconduct the entire study, and I'm waiting to finish the data collection to see how the thoughts have changed, specifically relating to relinquishing control, which can always be a problem.
I just want to ask a question, what really motivates you in the first place to go for this research? And then it seemed like I just had a limitation. Do you encounter some problems?
Well, this research actually came out of when I switched from being an MA history student to the MLIS. My history research, my original master's thesis, I had to change my entire topic because the material wasn't easily available to me. I would have had to fly to New York and a few other places, and I couldn't afford that. So then I started looking at digital content and digital archives. And then Amy Cooper Carey's sucked me into MPOP and minimal processing, and I just started putting all of these things together, and social tagging seems like it would just be the perfect solution, but then framing it all. Some of the problems I ran into, doing an online study, I had over 200 people start. I had 60 complete it. So there were people, they were either taken out because they were intermediates. I had a lot of people that, after a while, the novice group was full. So they were then dismissed while I was still searching out more experts. And then I had people who read what was going to happen and started doing it and then realized, oh, he really did mean 2.5 hours. That it wasn't just a 5-minute thing. So the dropout rate took a bit of a toll. But I was still able to collect all the data in about 2 months. Poor Jihee.
3 months.
3 months. Okay, I'm happy to talk to anybody afterwards.
Thank you. Our last presenter, Dr. Anna Hoffman, and Michael, his advisor, her advisor, Michael, is going to introduce Anna.
Sorry. I need the whiteboard. I actually don't
No,
have
the
slides.
whiteboard is right there.
Yeah, okay, so I can't, yes, so I only have the small one. I'm sorry.
No worries.
Or actually, just open up
I can move. Thank you.
A Word document, and then it'll just be like, can you, like, with an actual marker there?
You can write with those ones.
Color, it's gonna, I don't have enough.
or there's a whiteboard right there.
Yeah, I'll use a regular whiteboard.
Put the lights on.
Yeah.
I'll move.
So I first met Donna in spring of 2008 at the Critically Thinking Information Conference that we held here at BWM. If you recall this meeting, she was very happy to see me. I had just been hired to join the faculty. She liked my work on privacy and Facebook. So fast forward 6 years, we just got back from a conference in Korea where we were presenting a project on privacy and Facebook. And have published other things in that realm. I've been very lucky to have Anna as my first PhD student. She will be starting in just a few weeks, a postdoc at UC Berkeley School of Information in their data science program. So congratulations on that. I have learned a lot having Anna as my student, and you will learn something today, and I don't want to take any more time, so please welcome Anna. Thank you.
Thanks, that was really nice. Hi, everyone. All right, so, hey.
I know, right?
Okay. All right, so this is going to be a little bit more conversational, and I've got about 20 minutes. So, sort of a broad overview of my work and what I did in the dissertation. So it's going to be useful to have some theoretical background. So we'll get into that in a second. But broadly, what I was interested in was exploring the Google Books project from a social justice perspective. And I come at the issue of social justice from political philosophy, and in particular liberal political philosophy, and we'll talk about that in a second. But first, when you think of social justice issues, or broadly ethical issues in technology, you all had lunch, so you're like, so we're going to talk. When you think of ethical issues in information or technology or social justice issues, what do you think of? Anything. We already had privacy. Michael mentioned this. We'll start with that one. What else you got?
Ableism.
Yeah, okay. All right, so, yeah. Something else happened?
Access.
Yes, access, good. All right, more ethics, more social justice.
Cultural sensitivity.
Right, yes. Good.
Noise.
What's that?
Noise.
Noise, all right. And how do you mean noise? I just want to make sure.
Endless noise and information without sense or silence.
Ooh, yeah. So like info overload too. And that sort of, that's one way, another way I've heard it described, right? Okay. And so how do we filter that? How do we get to meaningful information? Ownership, yeah, good. Ownership, and from there we got all kinds of like control, IP, intellectual property, lots of things fall out of that when we think about ownership of information. Technology, all right. How about like hacking? This is a good one, right? Hacking, hacktivism, and some more.
I thought you said happy.
Yes. And then also, I mean, we could lump in research ethics, right? Have a lot of research. So like, especially like how we conceive of our tools and how we conduct research, say over the internet, or how we engage the internet as a tool for sampling or for gathering participants and those sorts of things. So here, we're just getting started on the list. If you've got another one, seriously, just let me just shout it out. Just lose your count. So when we look at these, a lot of ethics issues and a lot of sort of the emerging frameworks or the emerging ideas for talking about information and computer ethics, especially in the 80s through into the 90s, was really focused on information technology as an instrument. It really had this instrumental bent. And let's see, we got some of these, like how technology as an instrument can invade people's privacy or can violate people's privacy. We think about sort of digital technology as like this tool for expanding and quickly replicating information that causes copyright concerns. We think of hacking and violations that people might, trespassing or other sorts of violations that people might commit through the use of technology. And so this is sort of what was known as the standard account of computer ethics, and it's very much aligned with other applied ethics movements, really focused on this sort of like this sort of instrumental view of information and technology. Then in about the late 90s and the early 2000s, you have a movement. You have a movement of ethicists and scholars who are pushing back against this a little bit. They're saying, okay, these are good. Thinking about the effects of the use of technology in society are really important, but it's not the whole of information and computer ethics. There are things that are reducible to use that we might want to consider from an ethical perspective. So we might want to consider things like biases embedded in design. And so you see something like ableist biases embedded in design. Technology designed in a way that is systematically discriminatory against people who have certain kinds of abilities. And so you really start to see this push. And one of these scholars is a Dutch scholar by the name of Philip Bray, and he developed a sort of heuristic or method for thinking about these sorts of non-instrumental, thinking about information computer ethics more broadly. And it's called disclosive It was originally called disclosive computer ethics. I think we're just calling it disclosive ethics now because it's like disclosive information and computer ethics. Disclosive information system. Like, I think it's just disclosive ethics now. We're just going to go with that. And disclosive ethics works along 3 lines. And this is broadly the method of my dissertation. If you haven't picked up on this yet, this is an unconventional dissertation. It's a philosophical dissertation. So it moves a little differently than the previous 2 presentations. So, disclosive ethics works at 3 levels. Disclosure, theory, and application. And this gives us sort of a systematic framework for interrogating information technology artifacts, systems, and moving beyond simply use in thinking about ethics in the context of information and technology. At the disclosure level, what you do is you stand up and you say, well, here are some dimensions or some features, or here's a technological artifact that has moral significance. So you sort of bring them to the table and you say, you disclose these as morally relevant, as having moral relevance. And you might also identify some values, some moral values, to pinpoint why they're morally relevant. So for me, I say Google Books, and in particular 3 dimensions of Google Books that I'll talk about in a minute, and I say social justice. So I'm picking up a set of values, and I'm picking up a set of features, and I'm sort of venturing forth, and I'm saying, all right, these are morally relevant. Now you have to, next step is then you have to start to show why these are morally relevant features. And then, so at the second step, you introduce theory. You interrogate extant philosophical or ethical theories in view of the technology that you're trying to ethically scrutinize. So you look at available theories and you ask, okay, what are the shortcomings of these theories for talking about this phenomenon? What are the strengths, perhaps? And what are maybe the gaps? What are the things that are missing in these conversations? And then you take step 1, step 2, and you apply the revised theory to the issue to arrive at some sort of, to deliberate morally about these features or artifacts. So it moves in these 3 steps. A large part of my dissertation takes place at the second level. The last chapter goes here, and the intro goes here. So I spent a lot of time scrutinizing a particular branch of political philosophy, because when I went to go look at Google Books from a social justice perspective, I immediately went to the liberal political philosophy that sort of engaged me when I first started as a doctoral student. And this is typified by the work of John Rawls, but it's certainly not isolated to Rawls, right? We have an entire 50 years of discussion, a really robust discussion that has grown out of this, the original publication of Rawls' A Theory of Justice in 1971. You have critics from a number of camps, and we'll talk about those in a second. So I was like, okay, I need to go and I need to check out this theory, I need to interrogate it, I need to ask questions about it, and see how I can apply it, how it's going to be useful to talk about Google Books. I started to do that, and I got really, really dissatisfied with extant applications of Rawls. It's perhaps, it's for a number of reasons, and one of them is my sort of introduction or my foray into Rawls was methodologically, and not sort of in the sort of a heavier or applied way that a lot of people have interpreted his theory. So I'm coming at it from a methodological standpoint. So I was really, really dissatisfied with what I was seeing, and all of a sudden that became a project unto itself. So I gathered as much as I could find, as many articles as I could find on that applied Rawls to information and technology issues. I think all told, I ended up with, since 1990, there have been about 150-ish applications of Rawls in journals related to ethics or human values or political or social justice issues in information and technology. So I have this body. I have this this body of the ways in which Rawls has been applied. So that's where I spent a lot of time in dissertation, and I start to interrogate that. So we're going to talk about that level now. First off, some background on Rawlsian justice. Rawls famously has 2 principles of justice. The first principle is what is known as the liberty principle, and the second principle is known as the equality principle. These are the two things that get focused on a lot. They're really succinct, they're really nice. The liberty principle says something along the lines of every person in a given society, it's designed to be applied in a contemporary liberal democratic societies. Every person should have access to the same scheme of liberties. These include things like freedom of expression, freedom of speech, things that we're very familiar with from, say, the Bill of Rights, the United States Bill of Rights, and the same scheme of political liberties, so equal vote, and these sorts of institutions that we're familiar with from liberal democratic societies. And then, so the first principle spells out these liberties. The second principle guarantees or works or tries to guarantee equal value of these liberties for people. So they're lexically ordered. So so considerations from the second principle cannot be, we cannot violate the first principle in order to fulfill considerations from the second principle. We have to make sure this is fulfilled first, then we can move here. And under the equality principle, we see things like his famous difference principle, which, let's see, how do we articulate the difference principle easiest here? It's a statement about equality, and, oh my god, I am totally, Tom, David Lipinski, help me out with the difference principle here. Yeah, see, right? So,
Remember, any imbalance has to be.
Yes. So basically, any inequality in society has to be justifiable to the least equal. All right. So it's a statement about what inequalities in society are justifiable. So if we accept that eliminating all inequality is going to be impossible or not a pragmatic task, we need a way to justify what inequalities do exist. Yeah.
What makes that different from the Pareto principle? Isn't that just the inverse?
So yes, the Pareto principle. And Amartya Sen has a good paper on this, on the impossibility of a Pareto liberal, right? He talks about how, so you can't justify the improvement in one person's stock or in one person's life at the detriment of another, right? So if you want Pareto equality, an increase for one can't be a decrease for another. It has to move the whole society up.
So it's just the inverse. What you're calling the difference principle is really just the inverse of the Pareto.
Yeah, so Rawls grounds his conversation of the difference principle in Pareto, in this sort of reasoning. He breaks from it in subtle ways that I don't cover in the dissertation, and I'm not going to cover here. But yes, it's tied to that and it's related to that. And then Sen is one of Rawls' critics, and we'll get there. We're not going to get there, but talks about challenges this along these lines, and it's commitment to Pareto style reasoning. So the Pareto principle. All right. So, but behind these two principles, this is what a lot of people focus on. But these two principles are the result of a lengthy process of reasoning, and they fall out of this process of reasoning. It's not sort of unconventional in my considerations of Rawls, my applications of Rawls, because I kind of don't care about the actual principles that he comes up with, which is like blasphemous. But I'm really interested in the ways in which he arrives at this, which he arrives at these two principles. And he does that through a series of model conceptions. And we're not going to get to them all. So, why is the method important? Let's talk about why the method is important, and then I'll go on to the applications. So, there are two ways we can think about achieving fairness in society. And a really good example is, let's say we have a cake and we have two people. We have to split the cake between two people. All right, so one way to conceive of a fair distribution of cake between the two people is that there is an exact middle. Like there's an exact way to cut this cake and two absolutely equal halves, and you give them out. Now, that's a perfect model, right? Like we can imagine that there is an absolutely perfect middle of this cake, and we can try to cut it that way. We can use our electron microscopes to get down at the molecular level and try to really divide this cake exactly perfectly. And at the end of the day, we just have to trust that we got close enough. All right? For us, this is not a sufficient foundation for justice. Instead, there's another way we can think about dividing this cake, and that's first person cuts, second person chooses. Right? And so if I have a cake, and this would have to be my distribution, and we'll say that's perfect on this sort of first conception of justice. On a second, I could cut the cake like this, and the other person gets to choose first, and they take the bigger piece, but I got to cut first, and so this is fair. Not because of the result, not because we're measuring the end result or the end distribution, but because the process was fair. And so this is sort of the grand scheme. This is why the procedural elements of Rawls's theory are so absolutely important, because that's where justice inheres. These are just the fallout. These are the principles that fall out of that process. But when you look at the way that Rawls has been applied to information and technology, it's been cherry-picked. People take little bits of the first principle, little bits of the second principle. They take pieces from they take the difference principle. They take all these little sort of cherry-picked pieces, which are really great illustrative tools. But they miss the thrust of this sort of procedural dimension of Rawls's theory, Rawls's method. And when you focus on his method, a couple of things come to the fore. And that's the importance of the basic structure of society. He calls it the argument from the basic structure. And self-respect. And so what I do in the dissertation is I look at these applications and I say, we've overlooked these two. What happens if we foreground these two dimensions and let the other stuff take a backseat instead? And so I develop, in contrast to what I call the standard account of Rawls, a socio-technical account of Rawls, because I think that we can account for information technology issues in really interesting ways if we focus on basic structure and element of self-respect. So the basic structure allows us to think about the ways in which technologies not only can be used for unjust ends, but produce injustices themselves. And the example of ableism is a fantastic example of that. So we could distribute a particular technological artifact to everyone, and that'd be great. But if that artifact is not usable by a segment of the population that we've distributed to, it doesn't matter how far we've distributed this artifact, this device. It has biases in it that still discriminate against particular users. Second, Rawls thinks that self-respect should be a evaluative criteria for any principle of justice. So any idea or any just society would be sustainable, and it's sustainable by giving people a platform upon which to develop their sense of self-respect. And a lot of Rawls's critics have done a good job of articulating why this matters. African-American political philosophers have talked a lot about the civil rights movement as not only a process of gaining rights, but a process of liberating self-respect. Queer theorists, some queer political theorists have talked about the gay rights movement in a very similar way. So we want to not only build technologies that don't have these, that avoid or that don't exhibit these sort of embedded biases, but we also want to build technologies and systems and that support a robust foundation for self-respect for a diversity of users. Google Books, coming all back around. So I go through this theory, I develop this alternative framework, and then I go through 3 dimensions of Google Books and I apply each dimension. First dimension of Google Books, quality of the scans. How many of you are Google Books users? Yeah, okay, you've been to Google Books. How many are familiar with the art of Google Books? It's this fantastic Tumblr that goes through and finds, this fantastic blog that goes through and finds all these like weird scanning errors in Google Books and like distortions and like kind of like where things get lopped off and they create these really weird found poems. So there are all kinds of examples of this. Like the quality of the Google Books archive is notoriously low. It's not so low that it inhibits reading, but it definitely falls short of the standards set by information professionals. However, from a standard account or from a purely distributive account of justice, of Rawlsian justice, this would just have to be conceived of as a pragmatic trade-off. Right? We want to expand access, we want to distribute more copies of books, whether that's digitally or whatever, we want to get them out there, we're going to have to make this sort of trade-off. From a perspective, from a socio-technical perspective, if we think about the ways in which technologies produce inequalities, now we have a subset of people who are entirely subject to Google's standard settings and Google's quality standards, where you still have a class of people who have access to research libraries, well-endowed public libraries. You still end up doubling down or reproducing this divide in a different way. So if we look at this through the standard lens, we don't see a social justice issue. If we look through the socio-technical lens, we can see how there might still be something worth attending to here. The second one, the way Google Books handles indexes is really fascinating. Back of book indexes. So if you go to in copyright book, you are going to get only a preview of the book, right, in Google Books, and they lop indexes out of that preview. You're not allowed to see a preview page of an index. You're only allowed to see a snippet of an index, which is like the 2-line little snippet, if your keyword search in their Google search bar matches one of the keywords in the index. Then you can see a sliver of the index page. All right, so you have now set up, Google Books now sets up this dichotomy between one type of navigating text, which is full text search, which basically amounts to concordances of word and instances of words in text, and then you have the qualitative information work that goes into making an index by indexers, right? And human-made indexes have all kinds of considerations beyond concordances. They can connect books to other texts in the domain. They can pull in concepts that might not be named in the book, but are relevant to the book. And so you have all this kind of value that's added to a text, and Google Books does away with that and prioritizes its keyword mode of searching. And it's the technical rationality of the Google sort of imposition of the search box. So here we see the value, we see one type of knowledge, one type of understanding in text, prioritized at the expense of another one. Where this is something, if we're looking at just purely the distribution of books, like on a standard account of relevant information and technology, we would miss. It would not come up as a sort of issue. And then the last one is the value of information for Google versus libraries. Most of the books in Google Books came out of libraries, and that's a really important point. They asked publishers to come forward with books originally, and they got a few thousand titles for their archive, but it's cool, yeah. They went to libraries, like, oh hey, we'll scan your collection for you, and we'll give you a copy of it when we're done, so you get free scanning, and then we're going to run with your text. And now they have nearly 30 million books. So libraries are absolutely indispensable to the success of Google Books. You cannot think of the success of Google Books without understanding and without thinking seriously about their relationship to libraries. So, but we also then need to think critically about what happens to these books when we remove them from the context of a library and we put them in the context of Google Books. For libraries, especially public libraries, especially large public libraries, the value of a text, the value of a piece of information is derived from its value, is derived from its democratic mission. Ideally derived from its democratic mission. We're working at a philosophical level here. And so, whether or not a particular text is valuable depends on whether or not citizens who make claims on this institution of the public library find it valuable. For Google, the value of information in their repository comes from whether or not they can connect a given piece of information to a given keyword, and those keywords that they can then sell to market. So it's a very different ideology that frames the value of books in these two contexts. But if we're thinking purely about the distribution of texts, that's another thing that we miss. We don't have any tools to think about. The value or the context of those texts. But if we think about the ways in which technologies help reproduce certain social relations or certain types of inequality, then we have a way to start to think about this issue in libraries. And then, from the perspective of self-respect, whether we're founding our possibilities to build knowledge and build a sense of self and build a sense of, or pursue our aims or pursue our dreams via information, whether we're doing that as a consumer or as a citizen have very different implications. All right, and one is a more robust foundation for building self-respect, or so I argue, than the other one. And I go into that in more detail in an article that's coming out in Library Quarterly sometime this year, later this year. And it's accepted, it'll be published one day. So that is the 23-minute overview of 250 pages, and so thanks. I'm exhausted. Ask me questions, but go if you need to. People have teaching obligations and things, classes, writing to. Yes.
Yeah. Did you think like the underfunding of libraries make library to compromise by submitting or handing over their books to the Google in the name of scanning?
So,
Like,
can you rephrase the question? I'm sorry.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
just lastly, you just comment on like libraries mostly just keep their books in the name of scanning to the Google.
Yeah.
So you mean that when the problem caused the library to compromise that kind of services, is it underfunding or?
All right. So why did libraries agree to do this?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a really good question, and it's not a question I don't explore any questions of motivation in the dissertation. But I will say that I think understanding the time at which Google Books comes into libraries. You have libraries which, like archives and the things that I talked about, are starved for funding, that want to move text into this digital realm, but don't have first off, don't have the technology to do it, because most technology was really awful. Like for an OCR scanner, that's the thing that pulls the text off. For that to work, the page of a book has to be flat. How many of you know a book to be absolutely cooperative with laying perfectly flat? And so it would destroy the book. You have to rip the binding out, or you have to press it down with glass. It was awful. Well, Google devised this method. They use stereo infrared cameras, and so they get a three-dimensional picture of the book, and then they do the flattening digitally. Now that they have a three-dimensional picture of the book, they can flatten the page in the computer, then dump an OCR scanner on it, and then we have a digital readout of the text. And so they have this innovative, patent-protected technology, patented technology, and then they also come into libraries at a time where, and I'm working on another paper on this, and I just presented at a conference on this, the Gender and Sexuality in Information Studies Conference, a colloquium at the University of Toronto's iSchool. You're looking at libraries in the early 2000s as institutions that have been going through decades of professionalization and the sort of increasing increasing creep of information technology into those environments. And so Google comes in not out of nowhere, but Google comes into an environment that's been primed for the arrival of Google. And so I think that's a really important thing to also keep in mind. And so for libraries, it looks like a sweet gig, right? Like you're not gonna destroy your books. You're gonna get a copy of your archive at the end of the day, and that's like of your collection at the end of the day, and that's a pretty cool thing. But there might be these other social, political, or economic consequences down the road, and that's more what I guess I talk about in the dissertation.
Okay. Did the library give anything based on your research on the analysis, the date, is it the currency, any book in the library based on your analysis and your research, you find what kind of categories of book normally library give out? Like, is it the more recent?
Oh, so they scan entire collections of libraries.
Yeah, I understand.
Right.
They scan the entire collection. What I mean, like, the kind of books maybe they can willingly to compromise to Google to just take it. Example, let me just give example with GWM library here. Supposing there are a lot of collection in, so you find that what kind of, in your research assessment, Google books, what kind of year category, the recency or the importance of the article that normally Google house in their own domain, rather, in the sense that are they are going to the recent publication, or library just give them what they don't want, or if they are not much important in their collection?
So if they're turning over entire collections, they're like I apologize. I am not meeting you halfway here, and I feel terrible. So what we're thinking about here is they turn over their entire collections, but do they value some parts of that collection more than others?
Yeah.
sorry, there's another, yeah.
Well, as I understand it, there still are copyright issues. Either the works have to be in the public domain or permission has to have been given, so it's not the whole collection.
Well, no, but they were giving over copyrighted works, and this was the basis of the lawsuit. The libraries are giving them everything.
But now,
Yes, so now they still, well, now Google, it's fair use. The ruling at the end of 2013, Judge Sin said their scanning of these books, including in copyright text, constitutes fair use. That was Judge Jenny Shin's ruling. And he said this great thing. Indeed, all society benefits from Google Books. And so they issued this fair use ruling, and Google's off the hook for these claims of copyright violation, but only because of the preview mechanisms that they implemented.
that's or the scan, right? So it's limited bits. You
Yeah,
can't read
yeah. So
all
you can
of
only see up
everything.
to 20% of the text, and it's just the text pages, not the indexes. And so accounting for copyright or responding to one policy then creates this other issue where you are now excluding indexes. And what's really fascinating is that in the original Google Books settlement, publishers gave up indexes. They didn't care. They were like, we're only concerned about the copyright content from page 1, chapter 1, end of last chapter. We do not care about back of book matter. We do not care front of book matter. They gave Google license to post these things, but Google still obscures indexes. But they don't obscure bibliographic material at the front of the book.
But reading only 20% of a book is not the same thing as reading a whole.
Absolutely.
Although my students seem to do well.
Separate matter.
But following up, and I'm sorry, I forget your name, the comment.
Yusuf.
Yusuf, okay, excellent. It's a different project, but an interesting question in terms, because I know entire collections were scanned, but like when Madison signed up for this, they started to pack books in boxes, ship them off to some undisclosed location. How did that library decide what do we send first? And it's just it's a wholly different kind of question.
Yeah, so I know that Madison also...
Was there some kind of approach in terms of what do we prioritize or not? Or what are we keeping out? Maybe they are keeping some out there.
Yeah, and Madison also had an on-site scanning station. And I know an academic library there who describes it as like this like moldy basement room that no one goes in anymore. It's like the ghost of Google is left there, and there should be like this like single light bulb interrogation room light swinging in it, like because they really did. They just came in and they set up this scanning apparatus, and they used grad students and other sort of like contract labor to scan those books. The same thing, and this is a whole other set of social justice issues that I do not talk about in the dissertation. But when those books were shipped to Google, they had a completely separate facility for scanning books. They were using contract labor, a lot of workers of color, a lot of really cheap contract labor. Some people have argued exploitative labor to scan these books, and that these books were it's an archive of pictures of books, technically. And it's built on the backs of this sort of shady labor. These employees didn't have Google badges. They couldn't go and get the free meals. They couldn't ride the segways around the campus. Like they were shuttled in, did their scanning, and shuttled out. And that's a completely different set of issues that I don't go near, but it's interesting that you bring that up. Yeah.
Do you have any idea how they dealt with things like different instantiations of a particular published work? Like if there's a revised edition, did they make any plans for like, well, we're going to get all of these instantiations?
Yep. So the way that they dealt with that was terribly. So there's this fantastic article by Paul DeGood, and somebody else knows how to pronounce that last name. He co-wrote The Social Life of Information. But he has an article in First Monday where he looks at just the book Tristram Shandy. I can't remember the entire title. It's like a long. The Life and Times and Adventures of the esteemed gentleman, Tristram Shandy. So they looked at this text, and there are multiple instantiations of it. And some interesting things happened. So each book is attributed with a different publication year. Inconsistent. The metadata is incredibly inconsistent across these volumes. And on the inside of this text as well, there's an iconic black page. The author inserted a black page as like a memoriam to the death of one of the characters. And the Google scanners are like, oh, this is junk, throw it out. And so like that iconic black page gets ripped out of the book in the digital version. And so, no, it was very much, these things got sacrificed in the name of efficiency to produce the Google Books collection. Somebody's got to have a political philosophy question. I know you're a student over there. In my review, by the way.
I'll ask you questions later.
Yeah, in my review of applications and roles, you showed up, and Dr. Cornelis showed up as well. She's not. Is she still in here? She left. All right. So I was like, there are a couple people showed up, and I also need to acknowledge 3 of my committee members are in here. Michael introduced me. He was co-chair. Will, Dr. Peacock, was on the committee, and Dr. Raymond, Sandra Raymond in the back. And so thank you again for all of your hard work.
So they did all the work, you just sign your name, right?
We beg to differ.
Yeah.